Perhaps we've all heard the story about the man who fell asleep during church one day, and then when he was asked later what the sermon was about, the only thing he could come up with was it was about sin. Well, we've all heard that, and unfortunately, we do know that we have to deal with sin as a reality and not just as kind of a funny little story. In Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 22, Solomon writes these words, "Surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins." Several things kind of pop out just from that one verse. Number one, it tells us that there is a such thing as a righteous man, that men can be right with God, men can be righteous. And how is that defined? Well, it says there's a righteous man who does good. So doing good and doing right and doing the things that God tells us through his word is how you define what a righteous man does and how a righteous man behaves. And yet the text also tells us that there's not a righteous man at all. There's not a righteous man at all who does these things and is this admirable in his conduct, yet without sin. All righteous men do sin. And while that may sound like a contradiction in terms, how can you be righteous and also sin? Notice that the emphasis here is on being a righteous man and not on being a full-time sinner, you might say. The idea here is that all men face temptation, all men face the trials and temptations of life that would bring us into that state of doing something that we know is wrong and doing something that we should not do, and therefore we sin. But it's not a lifestyle. The lifestyle here is about a righteous man, and it's not a lifestyle where a man is always regularly living as a sinful man. Those are two very different things. But perhaps there are two things here that are intended by this verse being in the Bible. Number one, I think it reminds us that all people do sin. And because of that, we need to realize that we're going to face that, and it secondly will help keep us humble. You see, we have to realize that if we get too hung up on being right about everything, we can become self-righteous, which is just as bad as being a sinner. In fact, it's just as sinful. And yet this text tells us that, well, we will be subject to temptations and sometimes we will give in. Therefore, we need to have a lot of humility. And so we also need to have a lot of thankfulness for God's grace and God's mercy that pardons us when we recognize that and we repent and we return.